Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Well, welcome this week to episode 16. Today our guest is Jack Jenkins, who is a national reporter for the Religion News Services in Washington, D.C., covering U.S. Catholics and the intersection of religion and politics. He is also the author of a new book that came out last year. Yes. Called American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of Our Country. It's a mouthful, but it's a good book. I read it. So would you tell us a little bit about American Prophets?
So first of all, hi everyone, I'm Jack. And secondly, yes. So technically it came out last year at the very beginning of the pandemic. It just came out in paperback. And it is a book on what is often described as the religious left, right? We often talk about the religious right. There's no shortage of books or conversations or coverage of that group, but there is this community and this, what I like to call a coalition of coalitions, known as the religious left. And while we do sometimes talk about them in a historical context, particularly when referring to, say, the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement in the mid 20th century, the reality is that in contemporary American politics, there have been a myriad of efforts led by people of faith, a much broader, more religiously diverse group of religious people than you might find in the religious right, but still a very religious group nonetheless. And it turns out. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so, I mean, when you think about like what you read on the news and stuff, right? Like if you hear those secular Democrats and then you have, you know, the conservative Christians, right? And so like to recognize that is not the divide.
No, I mean, the Democratic Party is a really interesting beast religiously because it is true that it has a giant chunk of it that is, you know, what it's referred to as the religiously unaffiliated, people who don't claim one religious tradition. Now, some of those people are atheists and agnostics, but actually most of them arguably just don't claim a religious tradition. And that group actually, you know, many of them pray daily and they have their own interesting relationship with spirituality. But the majority of the Democratic Party actually still reports a belief in God or a religious affiliation. And some of them are actually more church-going than the average Republican. So the Democratic Party has underneath its umbrella some of the most and least religious people at the same time. And so Democratic politicians often are put in an interesting position of having to appeal to both at once. And that's just the electoral politics conversation. That's distinct from talking about activism and, you know, how these groups have impacted everything from the passage of the Affordable Care Act to environmental fights such as, you know, the Standing Rock, to protecting immigrants with things called the New Sanctuary Movement. And it turns out faith communities have played a crucial role in these things that are often referred to as like, you know, mainstay progressive or liberal concerns. It's these prominent religious leaders and activists that have been driving a lot of that.
Yeah. And so you can read about that in American Prophets. It kind of talks about, you kind of start with the Obama administration on, kind of, yes, time-wise, you think?
You talking about, yes, actually. Well, there's one chapter I go back a little farther to talk about LGBTQ rights fights within a lot of denominations, but most of it really we're starting in the Obama administration. So, which is a good point because a lot of these activist communities and efforts actually started under Obama. Some of them were actually protesting Obama for not being liberal enough on certain issues. But one of the themes of the book is that you'll note this dramatic expansion of these communities and these activist groups after in and around Trump's election. And they proved to be particularly powerful and influential during his tenure.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that in the discussion at hand for today. So we have been following that Revised Common Lectionary and talking very specifically about specific Bible passages so far in our podcast. But we're going to veer away from that a little bit today. and for the next few weeks. So for the next 5 episodes, we're going to do a mini series to talk about some relevant theological discussions, conversations that I think that, maybe not directly related to the Bible, but are ones that like we experience and hear about in the news and on social media all the time. And so it's good to have just a good conversation about these things. And also, if we did talk about the Bible, it's mostly about bread for the next 5 weeks. And so like, I don't know about you guys, but I can only Bible carb load so much before that's not interesting anymore. And so I thought this might be a little bit more interesting. And so Jack here, clearly, as you can already hear from him, is kind of an expert in the particular topic at hand that we're going to talk about. But also I want to point out to those that have been like, wow, AJ, every single one of your guests so far have been like a pastor or a deacon or like a seminarian who just got their master's of divinity and is about to become a pastor. And so I want to point out that like not everybody that gets a master's of divinity is a pastor. And so Jack, being one of those people, does have a master's of divinity and uses that in a calling in a different way than becoming a pastor.
It's true. And I can attest that I do use it every day. I use my training every day, but in ways that I don't think I expected to use them when I was learning Greek and Hebrew.
Oh yeah.
So,
Well, our topic at hand for today is that I'd like for us to have a conversation about Christian nationalism. And really like what that is and what does that mean? Because that's a word I think that we also can just, we can hear that thrown around a lot in the media and may not totally understand what it is. But so Jack, can you tell us a little bit about what, if you can find a definition for like Christian nationalism, what that is?
I think the most simplistic understanding, and honestly, the best place to start when having this conversation in 2021 is that Christian nationalism circa this era is about the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. And importantly, the idea that it should remain that way, or that if it has moved away from that founding, it needs to return to it. And that second piece is really important because it informs a lot of the activism and a lot of the actions of Christian nationalists here in the last few years, particularly during the Trump era and immediately after. So it works off of this understanding of American history that many scholars argue is ahistorical, that America was founded specifically as a Christian world. Some people argue that it was founded as a Christian mission ground, and that if it upholds those views, then God will continue to bless it, what have you. But that's the foundational principle I think that a lot of the rest of it hinges on.
I have a question. You may know the answer to this or not. So like there was at one point in time, like as the Europeans did go out and colonize other places, the Papal Bull actually, they were colonizing them in the name of Christianity, and you go there, those people accept it, or you kill them and take the land. That's not what happened in the United States, correct?
Well, so yes and no. Fun fact. So a few different things are true at once. It is absolutely true that the doctrine of discovery, which is the Papal Bulls you were referencing, I believe, as well as manifest destiny, obviously led to a lot of horrific things done in this country, particularly the westward expansion and the colonization effort. The part that gets complicated is this understanding that in the colonial era and in the revolutionary era, that all of the different groups that were fighting for the revolution, as it were, agreed that each other were Christians, which was not the case. When people forget, when the Pilgrims, as it were, landed in Massachusetts and New England, they were fleeing religious persecution, but within a generation, within 40 or 60 years, they wwere hanging Quakers for worshiping differently than them. And that was pretty standard. So we had these different pieces up and along the East Coast of what was then the colonies, some of which were trying to model religious tolerance, others of which were vehemently the opposite of that, establishing state religions, mandating worship in certain ways and refusing to allow for other religious groups. And so this idea that America was a Christian nation around the time of the revolution presumes that these people thought each other were Christians. Fun fact, Thomas Jefferson particularly did not like Jesuits and Presbyterians for some reason. Those are his least favorite groups of religious people. He wrote about them and said pretty bad things about them. And of course, Jefferson himself, as a religiously interesting figure, often described as a deist. He had his own version of the Bible where he cut all the miracles. Again, all of this history often gets lost in a Christian nationalist's understanding of our founding.
Yeah. So you bring up a good point to just like to think about that. People are like, oh, well, they were all Christians. I'm like, they all might have like, I think that all of them definitely had their different level of where they were at theologically. But as you pointed out, like Thomas Jefferson literally took his Bible and cut out the parts that he didn't like.
Right.
Like, what is
removed
that?
all the miracles. Yeah.
What does that say, maybe? And I actually wonder if some pretty like conservative Christians like heard that, like, no, he would never do that. Well, he did.
He absolutely did. His understanding of, I defer to scholars who know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that Jefferson in particular was one of many of the quote unquote founding fathers whose understanding of Christianity was very distinct from what you might argue a modern evangelical Christians is. It's not to say that there weren't people at our founding who actually were kind of Christian nationalists. There's actually one group who I believe they're called the Connecticut Wits. You can check me on that. They were apparently a group of poets, and apparently laughably bad poets, like were very bad poets, who wanted to install a Christian theocracy. Although interestingly, distinct for their time, they wanted to install a virulently anti-racist Christian theocracy, and were drowned out by any other forms of racist democracy that we ended up creating. And so again, versions of Christian nationalism have cropped up at different points in American history, but the idea that it was founded with this comprehensive understanding of one uniform faith that all must worship and abide by, that's just not necessarily supported by the historical evidence, according to scholars.
I mean, listen, if you can be mean to Quakers, there's already a problem, I think. I don't know how anyone can be mean to Quakers.
Puritans were very mean to Quakers.
Hard to say. Anyways, when can you say is like sort of the emergence of this more like modern Christian nationalist movement that we have?
So a few different points, and cut me off if I get too long. During the 1800s, there were again homages to Christianity and Christian nationalism at different times, but it was kind of around the tail end of the 1800s, early 1900s, where we saw the rise of what we now know as the Ku Klux Klan, right? That was an overtly, unapologetically Christian nationalist movement. And I think it's important to point back to that because it had a very clear in-group, out-group idea, right? They would burn crosses on the yards of Black people, but also Catholics and Jews, and anyone else they decided was an out-group, but also envisioned a version of America that was exclusively like them, and clearly a vision of Christianity that they were trumpeting as like the true form. Around the same time, you saw different forms of this crop up in other places. And this is not a comparison I'm making, by the way. This is one that a scholar of the Holocaust made for me, which is that in Nazi Germany, there were iterations of Christian nationalism that emerged as well. Now, that was particularly attached to a central figure in that instance, which was, Hitler. And some people thought him as the second coming of Martin Luther, right? So that's particular German history of Christianity there. But it wasn't exclusively there, nor is religious nationalism, broadly speaking, a uniquely American phenomenon. But as we got past a lot of that, when we were in the 1930s and 1940s, fundamentalist Christians who had been in fights with liberal Christians, who were actually the ones who were the ascendant form of faith in politics at the time, they kind of lost, the fundamentalist Christians had lost in the public sphere a lot. They had lost some of their public battles. And meanwhile, the liberal Christians had championed something called the social gospel, which was this idea that, it was a critique of the Industrial Revolution in a lot of ways. It was calling out, workplace abuses and, economic distribution issues. And many people saw that as a threat to big business. And they were probably right to some degree. And I should note that the New Deal, the classic piece of liberal legislation, was apparent, according to historians, deeply informed by the social gospel. All of this is relevant because a group of big businesses and corporations got really frustrated by this theology and actually helped fund and organize a group that helped started pushing back against this. And it was a group of pastors, and they kind of handpicked certain pastors who, some of whom were kind of the proto mega pastors, as it were, some of the big, health and wealth pastors of their day. And this movement ended up, they printed sermons, they published them everywhere, and they would marry Christian identity and the American flag. The idea that to be American was to be Christian. And also that all of that led to pro-capitalism, right? Like that was also tucked in there.
Well, of course,
well.
I'm not surprised for a second that this is all money driven. That's really just kind of how this country functions. Just assume that at any point in time, there's probably dollars driving the bottom line.
Yes.
And so I'm not surprised at all, which makes sense. I hadn't heard that before, but that makes total sense to me, how that would have started to get driven. Because you're right. If you think about a lot of the people that benefit from the system being the most conservative that it could possibly be are the people that have that money sitting there, and coming up with ideas that would push against that, and more egalitarian ideas, as Jesus did preach, right? Like, who did Jesus always preach again, right? The empire. Who are the people that are going to have the toughest time? The rich, right? And so, like, for someone to actually start pointing that out, that could be a big problem for those guys.
And this is all chronicled in a book by Kevin Kruse. I believe it's called One Nation Under God. Again, check me. If you Google that, it'll come up.
You're going to send me that in a message so that I can attach it to the episode so people can find it.
Gotcha. And thank you. And it chronicles kind of the development of, I believe it was the spiritual mobilization movement was its title. And Kruse argues that it was the kind of the precursor to what became the religious right. And he predicates that on the idea that it was this group and it was this movement that kind of helped lead the way to changing, our national anthem, not the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, to include that under God stipulation, right? One nation
that get added?
Under God. I believe it was 48. I'm not totally sure. Someone should check me.
But it was in the 20th century, right? Like, that's not original.
No, it is not original to the pledge.
And it was added purely at trying to get these ideas kind of pushed forward.
Well, it was also couched in this sort of, Cold War anti-communism push, right? And so that's where this movement got a lot of energy, was that you're like, hey, if communism is associated with atheism, then we, the United States, should be associated with democracy and religious identity, particularly Christian religious identity. And so that ended up, in the 50s and the 60s in particular, fueling the development of a group of, churches and organizations and publications that not only countered liberal Christianity, right? So like the development of the publication Christianity Today was widely seen as a way to counter the liberal Christian publication, The Christian Century, and the development of several evangelical Christian, what we now understand as evangelical Christian colleges and universities and institutions were developed to kind of counter a lot of what we now call mainline Christian institutions. So fast forward to the 80s and the 90s, and the religious right begins to rise. And this is primarily around opposition to abortion and opposition to same-sex marriage. And those two issues in particular, now that the religious right had this whole infrastructure, they were able to exact power in the political sphere. And so that meant, public advocacy, the quote unquote values voters, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, all these organizations.
Morality, the moral majority.
Exactly. And so all of that, again, often trumpeted this idea of not in the most explicit form of Christian nationalism, but the idea that to be American was to be Christian was often suggested pretty heavily in a lot of this rhetoric, sometimes explicitly. So that sets the stage for George W. Bush's election, in the early 2000s, and how he was really benefited from evangelical Christian votes and support.
Well, I was reading something that even before that, really what the Reagan era, how that just changed the conservative mindset in the country a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, it was the influence of conservative Christians was not inconsequential during the Reagan era either. And again, it should be noted that what's interesting about all of this is, this is something I kind of outline in my book, is that, liberal Christians and liberal people of faith more broadly weren't idle during this time period. Obviously, the civil rights movement happened in the midst of this.
Right.
But the religious right was working very hard to build a power structure to exact, to influence the country, and so that it could better represent the values that they were arguing for. And by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, in some ways, because the religious left, as it were, had been so successful early on in the 20s, a lot of those organizations had become less powerful because the values that liberal Christians and liberal people of faith had advocated for had started to already be inculcated into society. Now, never mind, there's a lot of critiques of that too, but what it meant is that the religious right kind of didn't have a whole lot of counter by the time they were talking in public in the 90s and early 2000s. They, in many ways, won the idea of what it meant to be a religious voter in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening then is there are these pockets within these religious right communities where the Christian identity and the idea that America is a Christian nation becomes very intense and very explicit. Mm-hmm. One of the early heroes of this movement was a guy named Roy Moore, who was a judge in the Southeast, and he had wanted to put a plaque of the Ten Commandments on public property, and it became this whole fight and this debate about whether or not that was a violation of separation of church and state. He was kind of made himself a public political martyr in a sense, in the political sense of saying, I'm willing to lose my job and what have you, in order to defend these principles. And these little things like that started happening quite a bit. Now, of course, Roy Moore reappeared a few years ago when he was running for Senate in the state of Alabama, and he was a uniquely flawed candidate who was dogged by allegations of sexual abuse of minors, and ended up losing to a Democrat, installing a Democrat in the state of Alabama as a senator for the first time in quite some time. Wow. But he ran on an unapologetically Christian nationalist platform, and that that kind of Christian nationalism got even more accentuated in the early 21st century around in the aftermath of 9/11.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, I know that so 9/11 is a benchmark that made some changes in Christian nationalism. And then again, we'll see another benchmark in changes as the religious right throws their weight behind Donald Trump purely as an opposition to the Obama era.
Yes, that's a shorter version of that. Exactly, is this idea that
well, now tell me more. So what happened to Christian nationalism post 9/11?
So I mean, I think it is documented, is well documented in the aftermath of 9/11. Hate crimes against Muslim Americans skyrocketed, and even against people who, folks thought were Muslim, right? So minority groups in general suffered from this wave of Islamophobia.
Question, because there's kind of there are many, I want to reflect on that. There are many different distinct parts of Islam, right? That they're not all just Muslims are not all the same. But one in which that I want to question for you that is a little bit separate, particularly is the African American Muslim community. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, did they have the same impact as those of Middle Eastern descent?
Were they also victims of
as much
anti-Muslim hatred? I don't know. I don't have the data for terms of as much. I do know it absolutely affected their community as well. Okay. And that's African American communities in general have a disproportionate impact of hate crimes to begin with. So compounding it all. Right. But they were not. It is absolutely true. They were not exempt from this wave of anti-Muslim sentiment, right? And so we saw this opposition to mosque building here in the United States. There were all these demonstrations from mostly conservatives when a new mosque would go up.
And a big one. So there's now a mosque that is across the street from the 9/11 memorial.
Yeah, right. I remember that. The Park's 41, Park 71. There's one of those two is the name of that mosque. Or it was there was a whole controversy around the building of that I'm discussing. But in general, and of course there were Muslims killed in 9/11 in the World Trade Center, right? Like this idea of what it meant to be an American, there was this whole dialogue, and actually, interestingly, George W. Bush actually did a lot of rhetoric against anti-Muslim hatred. He actually, as a president, did. There's some evidence to suggest he gave some speeches, and there was an impact of his speeches, to try to say, to be Muslim is to also be an American. But it didn't stop the fact that there was also this rhetoric, and this anti-Muslim movement that kind of often conflated American identity over and against a Muslim identity, and as part of that American identity, a Christian-centric identity.
So, question with that too: where then is the intersection also of race? Because a majority of those that would kind of fall into this category of Christian nationalists are white.
Right. And so this is something, so many people argue that you should refer to Christian nationalism as white Christian nationalism.
Oh, okay.
Because, and that argument is rooted in the fact that, the victims of extreme versions of Christian nationalism are disproportionately people of color and people who are not Christian. And, one thing that Christian nationalism in many of its forms obviously has been decried. There's a whole contemporary conversation about this, but many African Americans and African American scholars have argued, they've been decrying Christian nationalism since it existed, because it never fully included even their forms of faith early on, much less people who were African American. Again, the Ku Klux Klan is another example of a Christian nationalist entity. But in this contemporary context, right, I think there's a reason why, one of the most attention-getting, policy proposals that Donald Trump made during his 2016 campaign was he proposed banning Muslims from entering the country. And that proposal changed a little bit when he became president, but he explicitly called for banning Muslims.
But he still did it.
The nation. And again, it's interesting to note, when there were those protests when he became president and that ban and the travel ban was passed, who was there protesting it, right? It was primarily religious liberals and, people of color and religious people of color who were there holding scripture from different faith traditions, welcoming people into the airport, who might have been banned by the Trump administration. And so what Trump kind of became through his campaign and into his presidency, some people who were pretty overt, explicit Christian nationalists attached themselves to his presidency. And I will know this was a little interesting because.
So why? I'm curious about this. Why? I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about why did Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, throw their weight behind Donald Trump, a person that, first of all, is a mainline Protestant. Not a very good one, as you well know.
Also not anymore, but I'll come back to that.
I want to hear about that. During his campaign thing, he was a Presbyterian. He went to Presbyterian churches, which again would fall into that category of that religious left, for sure. Right. And so so he's a person that, a lot of those things that conservative Christians throw their weight behind, of family values, blah, 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 blah. He doesn't uphold any of these, right? And so, what made them throw their weight behind him?
So a few things are true at once here. One is that it should be noted that Trump, the Presbyterians during his campaign, the Presbyterian Church USA, which was the denomination of the church he kind of grew up in, actually tried to kick him out of the denomination, but they couldn't because he's not actually a member of NAPC USA Church.
Oh.
And also, right after he was elected, there were two Presbyterian ministers that actually visited him at Trump Tower. And reporting from that moment indicates, reportedly, Trump did not know what it meant to be a Presbyterian. He was unclear about what they were.
So he was decidedly pretty unreligious person. Is that really what it comes down to?
I mean, I think a point of comparison might be the current president, right, who goes to mass every week, sometimes multiple times a week. Trump was not a regular church-going president, during his tenure as president, and did not seem to be, quite a regular churchgoer before he ran for president either. But so there's that one piece. A second piece is to note that one of the people that Trump will be able to reference, a faith leader that Trump would be able to reference pretty instinctively when asked, was Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale was a pastor who many people believed as one of the first iterations or a proto-iteration of what we now call the prosperity gospel, which is this idea that a simplistic interpretation of it is that if you just believe in God enough, God, you will be given blessings, usually of wealth. And manipulations of this theology even further often manifest as if you believe in God enough, you'll be given wealth. And in order to show that belief, you should give your money to the pastor. And some of the largest churches in the country are prosperity gospel churches.
This is why we have pastors that have, $1 million jets and tote around some crazy fashion.
Yes. And as you can imagine, and Norman Vincent Peale, by the way, was asked to lead that 1930s, 1940s era of spiritual mobilization movement. But Kevin Kruse, the author of that book, told me that it sounded like speculated that it sounded like he didn't take it, probably because he thought he could make more money selling his books. He had written a very successful book called The Power of Positive Thinking, or that he just didn't see it as worth his time. It's not clear why he turned it down. But I'll note that there's a connection here, right? And Trump had allied himself with some prosperity gospel preachers who historically had not been politically active. The prosperity gospel often kind of avoided politics. That was controversial and not necessarily good for the bottom line, metaphorically and perhaps practically for some of these churches. So, for instance, one of Trump's most trusted faith advisors was a pastor by the name of Paula White, who was widely labeled as a prosperity gospel preacher out of Florida. And these were people who had not participated really actively in politics before, but they assembled around Trump. And these were people he had hung out with, or at least aided in previous years. And for instance, Joel Osteen, who is another person that many people label as a prosperity gospel preacher. He has the largest church in America in Texas. And when he launched his Sirius XM radio station in 2014, one of the first guests was Donald Trump, right? So this was a community that Trump actually did have some access to. But then I feel like what's the real thrust of your question is, why would white evangelicals who had spent decades calling for, character among politicians or these sort of family values, throw their weight behind this guy who quite frequently would toss those away in terms of in his personal life before running for president? And the answer to that question isn't clear to anyone necessarily, like crystal clear. And since we don't have specific evidence, even ask everyone in particular, but we did have this interesting poll that was conducted a few years before the 2016 election and around the time of the 2016 election. And the first time the poll was conducted, white evangelicals, among other religious groups, were asked, if do you think the character of your elected official matters quite a bit? And I don't remember the specifics numbers, but it was something like 3/4 said, yes, this is actually really important. And only like roughly a quarter or a little bit more than that said, no, I don't think that's super important. By the time Donald Trump started running for president, that entire statistic flipped almost entirely on its head, where suddenly among white evangelicals, that was it was no longer important, the personal character.
That's super hypocritical for people who seem to want to manage everyone else's morality in their own personal households.
Well, this was an interesting debate because there were evangelicals who came out very strongly against Trump. Russell Moore is a classic example, who ran the political arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, an entity that some people thought he would often label as part of the religious right. But he was one of Trump's biggest critics early on. But as it turned out, that cadre of white evangelicals who were deeply critical of Trump did not have the influence of the greater expanse of this population. And when we're talking about Christian nationalism, it is often white evangelical, but not exclusively. It also includes white Catholics or even some other groups that resonate with this identity.
Well, and I think that there are people, at least in a lot of mainline Protestant churches, there's still people sitting in your pews, no matter what you're preaching from the pulpit, that would agree with some of these ideals.
Right, and that is not. I mean, Trump did pretty well with white mainliners too.
Yeah.
His support among white mainliners fluctuated much more than it did around, and with white Catholics, it fluctuated much more than it did with white evangelicals, but he still enjoyed various levels of support with both of those groups. And so what was interesting is that when Trump started running for president, it looks like many people argue that there was this sort of transactional relationship with him among conservative Christians, where he said, look, I'm going to oppose abortion, and I'm going to hold the line as much as I can on LGBTQ rights, basically saying that I will endorse campaigns by conservative Christians that LGBTQ rights advocates say are just chipping away at their rights. And a big part of that was him saying, I'm definitely going to appoint conservative judges, either to the Supreme Court or to the federal bench. And he did all of those things. And he promised he was going to do them. And he was the candidate who was doing really well. So there's an element to where he had this transactional relationship with this community. But I don't think it should be ignored that there was a couple of sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who conducted some polling data and found that I believe the number one, outside of party identity, right, and antipathy towards Islam, outside of those two categories, the biggest indicator of support for Trump was support for Christian nationalism. And I think this is important to understand because Christian nationalism doesn't necessarily have a theology. It's an identity. It's a way of seeing oneself and the world. And the fact that Christian nationalism in these polls that these sociologists conducted also seemed to correlate with disproportionate opposition to refugees, to immigrants, right? To Muslims, and all of these things that seem to fit within Trumpism, particularly during his 2016 campaign. All of that adds together to a coalition that doesn't seem to match perfectly with what the religious right was preaching in the 1990s, but does overlap a lot with what Christian nationalism had been preaching, whether or not the religious right was letting it preach it the loudest or not for several decades.
Yeah. So before we started, I asked Jack leading up to this, I was like, is there scripture that like particularly, that kind of points to the foundation, or that like is built upon, that they can point to as Christian nationalism, saying that like we build upon this scripture? And Jack said,
so no.
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, yes. So sometimes you will see Christian nationalists refer to this idea that's rooted in a few different passages, that God blesses those who blesses the nations that worship him or her or God in general. And they're usually using him in these contexts, and condemns nations that don't worship God. And I think what's interesting about that is that then the idea is, well, if we don't create a Christian nation, whatever that means to those individuals, then God will lose the blessings of God in this context. And so sometimes you'll see that. You also saw a few different references to Trump in particular when people would root those his ascendancy in Scripture. So ironically, you found several kind of stalwart Christian nationalist faith leaders would argue that Trump's moral failings, that they would categorize that way, are actually evidence of God's favor, that he is like biblical figures like Cyrus, who might have been flawed, but that God can use imperfect vessels for great godly things. So as long as Trump was still saying the things that aligned with the greater religious right agenda, then he's just an instrument of God. And then others would reference Romans, where God, the scripture that people have long argued means that people that are leaders are ordained by God. So once Trump is elected, that was God who was doing that. In fact, Robert Jeffress, who is one of Trump's most stalwart faith supporters. He's a minister out of Texas. He actually preached a sermon called "America is a Christian Nation" in 2018. He also loaned out his choir to sing a hymn that was called a hymn-like ballad on July 4th in 2017 called "Make America Great Again." And on Inauguration Day, he preached a sermon to Donald Trump entitled "When God Chooses a Leader," and the idea that he was chosen by God by virtue of having been elected, full stop. And so now, what's interesting is, and the question that I asked people who had said this, including Paula White, I asked her this a few years ago. I'm like, would this also technically apply to Barack Obama and anyone else who's ever been elected ever?
Yeah.
Have literally all leaders been ordained by God? And they would be like, yes. I'm like, well, this gets really complicated, because that would mean a lot of really awful leaders in different parts of human history have all been ordained by God. Like, how do you parse this? And it should be noted that that same passage of Romans, often shored up what was called the divine right of kings, the idea that, kings were ordained by God, and thus you must swear fealty to them and their wishes because God has put them there. That was the specific theology that American revolutionaries
were against,
actively against.
Yeah.
And so it gets really
complicated. We're not into that. Wasn't that the whole point of the country?
And so, and again, it's not new that theology gets interpreted and scripture gets interpreted in different times and different eras, but it was really interesting that this conversation around theology within Christian nationalist circles was often less important than a conversation about history and about American identity, or at least it got less airtime. I'll put it that way. And that sermon that Jeffress preached about, American as a Christian nation, it doesn't deal a lot with scripture. It mostly deals with a version of American history. So
a version of American history,
right? And so one that many scholars and historians challenge outright. And so again, it's not unusual for these sorts of things to crop up. What became unusual was how it got attached to this one singular leader in this recent era, Donald Trump, and how he became this paragon of Christian nationalism. And I should note, something I referenced earlier, this transactional relationship he had with conservative Christians. When Trump left office, shortly before he left office, and in the months before, the election and when he was removed from office, he did an interview with Religion News Service, one that I did. And he told me and another writer that he was no longer a Presbyterian, that he is now a non-denominational Christian. And so, which is not always, but is often is associated with evangelical Christianity. And so there's one argument that says that Trump has in many ways come home to some of his most stalwart supporters throughout his presidency.
And do you think that their influence over him and their relationship through his presidency probably kind of caused that?
I can't speculate about the president's personal faith decisions. I will say that, some of his most stalwart supporters throughout all of his scandals were evangelicals, right? Like in the wake of Charlottesville, this has always stuck out to me. When, Trump made the infamous both sides argument, referring to counter demonstrators and white supremacists that marched there. When there were the Sunday shows, which are only all these Sunday news shows that try to cover and usually interview prominent political officials, I remember seeing that the White House, particularly on this one ABC show or CBS, I think it was ABC, the commentator said, "Hey, we reached out to the White House to see if they would send anyone to talk to us about this both sides remark. They didn't send anyone from the White House. Instead, they pointed us to Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty University." And that was who was speaking on behalf of the president, defending Trump in the aftermath of that scandal.
Jerry Jr.
Was Jerry Falwell Jr. So again, and that was a recurring pattern that often when the president encountered scandal, he would appeal to his faith-based supporters to help ride it out. So.
Okay. Wow. So what can you tell us about, so we have white Christian nationalism, and then we have just like white nationalism, and kind of where those intersect, or is there really a difference?
So this is a really good question, and it's an interesting question today, right? So for instance, I think many of the folks some of the folks who have argued that we should refer to it as white Christian nationalism as opposed to just Christian nationalism have pointed to those statistics I pointed earlier, which is that those who show heavy support for Christian nationalism also tend to show support for, also tend to exhibit anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, any number of things that are often associated with white supremacy. And in addition to that, right, we have, many people have argued that, for instance, the insurrection, which for the record was unapologetically included many people who were unapologetically Christian nationalists.
Right.
They were literally waving Christian flags as they were storming the Capitol. And we have heard many, and the Proud Boys, right? Like this chauvinist group. They prayed before, shortly before they were part of that group that stormed the Capitol. And I think many people have argued that, and we certainly have had reports from the Capitol Police Force that, the racism exhibited by so many of those insurrectionists was so intense. People were so scarred by that. Some of these Capitol Police officers, particularly Capitol Police officers of color, who had these racial slurs thrown at them by, reportedly by these insurrectionists. And so I think we see a lot of evidence that things that look like pretty explicit and overt traditional white supremacy tend to overlap with Christian nationalism. And again, we have this point of comparison with the Ku Klux Klan that was all of them at once, intentional, right? Like you didn't have to figure it out. Like they were very clear that they were all those things at once. And so, I think one of the only things that complicates this is that sometimes Christian nationalism can and has cropped up in communities that are not overwhelmingly white. So for instance, Trump launched his Evangelicals for Trump initiative for his re-election campaign at a primarily Spanish-speaking church in Florida. That does not, I think many people have argued that just because there might be people of color involved does not necessarily make an ideology not part of white supremacy. But I think that what you have often seen, including from scholars like Whitehead and Perry, these sociologists, have consistently seen patterns within Christian nationalism that echo or mirror, white supremacist ideals and identities, right? And so, and again, I think it's important to remember that so many of these people who belong to hate groups that were part of the insurrection were wearing banners and T-shirts that said things like the armor of God on them. And so that these things aren't cleanly extricable from each other, that you can just like cleave them into different categories, that it is far more overlap than I think some of the leaders of the movement would want to admit.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it was very clear, right? Like they thought what they were doing was God's work, right? That God clearly had ordained this one man to be president. And, the language about the election being stolen, right? And so that's what happened, right? Because there was so much voter fraud that the Democrats stole this election from God, right? Not just from them, not just from Donald Trump, but somehow that this was stolen away from God. And tied it to their Christian identity that way.
I mean, for me, there's that when insurrectionists stormed the Senate chamber, right? There's that video of the so-called QAnon shaman, Jacob Chansley, who's a complicated religious figure on his own. I will say that. He led a prayer in the Senate chambers, and he was surrounded by people who stopped what they were doing and lifted up their hands in prayer. And some of those people who were there have been almost explicitly Christian nationalists, or explicitly Christian nationalists in their rhetoric, and resonated deeply with that prayer. One of them did an interview that night in which he said that that prayer represented so much of what the movement, quote unquote, was to him. And so I think, we had people praying as they entered the chambers. There was one flag that got waved a lot, an appeal to heaven, which is what it says, and it has a tree on it. It comes from the American Revolution, but it was waved pretty frequently at Christian nationalist gatherings. For instance, the Jericho March, that was, a religious gathering on January 5th. Around the Capitol, where people processed around the Capitol, wanting hoping that the walls, I guess metaphorically, would tumble down, and give Donald Trump the election. You would see that flag quite a bit. And I think all of that leads to this pattern that while not every insurrectionist had the exact same faith, there seems to be a running trend of, a Christian nationalist identity. I should also note that there's a lot of overlap with this and the QAnon movement.
That's a whole separate podcast. We can not get into QAnon right now, or we will be here all day. But
I mention it only just to say this, which is that prophecy is really important in QAnon, and there's a whole element here that we haven't discussed around charismatic and Pentecostal Christians who have been very prevalent in this Christian nationalist movement, and prophecy is very important for them as well. And so while Scripture is a reference point, they interpret it live, in the moment by, often proclaiming that they have received a prophecy of what is to come. And so they are in conversation with Scripture, but that prophecy, matters quite a bit to them in a way that is different from what you might find in, say, a mainline Christian church.
Right. Yeah, that's totally different. Question though. So moving with what I would say is kind of the current issue with what we're seeing kind of unfold with Christian nationalism and how it's taking place in our political system is the need of those who feel that the election was stolen from God to put legislation in place to restrict voting rights.
Right. So that there are the larger conservative movement has a lot of different moving pieces, right? There's a lot of different players involved in that effort, and some who might have stormed the Capitol are not necessarily the same ones who are advocating for restricting voting rights or removing early voting hours, what have you. That having been said, it's noteworthy that some of the strongest voices coming out against these sweeping, like a slate of voting rights bills across often the Southeast, are some of the greatest critics are Black church leaders, right? So the AME denomination has threatened to boycott businesses in the state of Georgia who don't come out against this bill and support a federal legislation like the For the People Act, which just this past week did not get a vote for debate in the Senate, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And that, I just come back from covering a protest in DC yesterday where William Barber, who runs the Poor People's Campaign, was calling for these bills to be passed and for pushing back against these bills that are trying to restrict voting rights at the state level. And he represents the Poor People's Campaign. One of the 5 foundational tenets of the Poor People's Campaign is opposition to religious nationalism. And I bring that up because one of the interesting phenomenons about the rise of Christian nationalism during the Trump era is that rising against it has been this religious left, this progressive religious community constantly decrying it. And that includes Black church leaders, that includes Sikhs and Muslims and Jewish groups, that includes, liberal Christians as well. And there's like a whole group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism that has come out. There is a group that decried Christian nationalism as a heresy. Barber himself has implied as much, or at least, if not said as much explicitly, at least suggested heavily that religious nationalism tends to be in the heretical camp to him. And I think it's notable that these groups, tend to be on opposite sides of these movements. You don't tend to see a lot of Christian nationalists running to protect these voting rights bills right now. But you do see a lot of Black church leaders saying that we need to pass bills that expand voting rights, not restrict them.
Well, right. And so that's, so then the, critics of what happened in Georgia, right? So this is why, Georgia went blue, because some real groundwork, grassroots level effort was done to help African-American voters get to the polls, or help them be able to learn about how to mail-in vote, these sorts of things, so that they could vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden, the conservative legislators in Georgia were like, oh crap, we went blue because the Black people voted.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's try to prevent them from doing that. And it's not just, and so now there are other states that are starting to kind of to take this on, Florida being one, and then also about Texas. I have said this a lot this year, and so and clearly they know it too in Texas, which is why they're trying to pass these kinds of laws. Because I said Texas is going to go blue soon, and once it does, a Republican's never going to be president again. And
I will say that anxiety within conservative circles is real. The idea that if you lose Texas, like if Texas and California are both blue,
it was too it was too close for comfort for those conservative leaders. Can I in some of my reading today about this, because I did do a little homework, even though of course Jack has done most of the talking, but he does this professionally, so it's probably more to hear from him than it would be from me. But Paul Weyrich, who's the co-founder of the Moral Majority, in a 1980s speech to a group of evangelical leaders, pointed this out right away, this thing about voting rights. And he said, now many of our Christians have what I call the Gugu syndrome, the good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They have never been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Yep, this has been one of the consistent critiques of the religious right, is that one thing I've heard from critics of the religious right for quite some time is that it tends to privilege the voting rights and activism of people within its community and not necessarily the greater populace. And again, that's the critics saying that. And I think it's important to flag that, because that same criticism has reemerged recently. And again, because we're having a conversation about voting rights, and you often have some of the same theological camps represented, where you have, again, as I was mentioning, conservative Christians have been some of the biggest critics of the attempts to expand voting rights, these bills that at the federal level, and been some of the biggest champions of these, what are widely seen by many activists as voting restrictions at the state level. And now, what's interesting about that is the religious right and religious right organizations and leaders have been very meticulous about working to get out the vote from their communities at different times. Ralph Reed, for instance, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, has been very insistent about trying to make sure that voting rights, that his community, his constituency gets out to vote. What's been weird is that one of the big critics of this Georgia, one of the more recent bills in Georgia, one of the big criticisms of that has been that it restricted the ability to hand out water to people in line to vote. And, one of the biggest groups that does that are religious groups. In fact, there was a whole thing called poll chaplains in the 2020 election, where rabbis and priests and pastors were the ones handing out water to these various voters, particularly in urban areas and communities that are, often underserved. They don't have enough polling locations, so the lines get longer. Mm-hmm. And one of the criticisms I heard from those progressive liberal faith communities is that, there are these champions of religious freedom and religious liberty, these conservatives, Christian groups, and they weren't coming out in mass to support the religious freedom or the religious activism of these, faith groups who want to hand out water. They didn't hear a lot of support from that. So again, I hear echoes of that same debate in that speech that you just delivered. By the way, before I forget, I did want to say this earlier. I didn't get around to saying this. If you're interested about the overlap about racism and race and conservative Christianity and particularly Christian nationalism, and critics of conservative Christianity. There's a new book by Anthea Butler called White Evangelical Racism, and she's a scholar of religion at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe. And that, if you want to talk to somebody who actually does this studies this stuff for a living, she might be somebody to look into. But all of that comes back to the fact that, like, I think it was really interesting listening to, the Poor People's Campaign and advocates speak yesterday outside the Supreme Court before many were arrested, talking about how, for them, they see this moment as a way to hold the line, to maintain. The argument they made was that this is how they maintain voting rights that they got in the 1960s, that African Americans in particular were given in the 1960s. And, it certainly seems to be an animating factor. Jesse Jackson was there yesterday, getting arrested, this civil rights leader. And William Barber was also there getting arrested. And right before William Barber was arrested, is that, as protesters were marching up and down near him, and as he was standing in the middle of the road surrounded by police, he said, "It took this to get it," referring to voting rights, "and it will take this to keep it." So what we are certainly seeing right now is some deep theological disputes between conservative Christians and some of their, particularly white evangelicals, but conservative Christians in general, and more liberal people of faith, who not only see themselves on opposite ends of everything from refugee resettlement to immigration reform to how to handle the environment, but also seem to be in different places when it comes to voting rights.
Well, listen, I don't want to take up, we've had a really great conversation today. Thanks so much, Jack, for joining us. And, we could be here all day and still never tackle all that is Christian nationalism. But right. This is just a good intro into kind of what's been happening in our country for folks that are like watching that from the sideline, right? Of not really understanding what's going on in our political spheres, and how does our faith, get into that, right? Because, like, as much as we say maybe separation of church and state, like if we are, faithful followers of Christ, right, that's going to influence us in some way or another. And so it does come up. But so thanks, Jack, for joining us. Next week, you will hear another fancy guest who is going to talk about another one of our fun mini-series topics. So please look for that soon. And as always, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/shit they don't tell you on Sunday, and subscribe so that you can get notifications of what's coming up next. And hopefully you can join us for the entire mini-series these next weeks. Anyways, take care, everyone.